Hello, Econ 151 students. Before we get started on our Chapter 15 homework dealing with monetary policy, I thought it might be helpful to review some of the basic concepts of monetary policy, what its goal is, how it's organized, things like that. So to begin, our definition of monetary policy is the actions of the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is not the federal government. It is a quasi-private banking institution that functions as our central bank. If you'll remember what we looked at in the last chapter, we realized that banks have this power through the multiplier effect to create money. And so because of that power, it's important that there is a central bank to help to kind of harness that and use it to affect changes in the money supply when times call for it. So the three tools that the Federal Reserve uses to make these decisions and to manage the money supply are first the reserve requirement. In the examples we looked at before, we always held that there was a reserve requirement established by the Federal Reserve. And they have the ability, if they want to change it. So a change in the reserve requirement would have a pretty drastic effect on banks. It does not happen often, by the way, because it interferes with the bank's ability as a business to plan for the future, but it is a tool that they have at their disposal. So a change in the reserve requirement that is a contractionary change. So if the Federal Reserve looks out at the economy, they see inflation coming, they see all kinds of problems, what they would do is they want to contract the economy, they want to decrease the amount of money moving through the banking system and through the economy, so they would raise the reserve requirement. And if you remember a simple multiplier, it's 1 divided by the required reserve ratio, and that would cause that multiplier to go down. As that number got bigger, the multiplier itself would decrease. So that would contract the economy. The other policy they can take that is a change in the money supply is expansionary, and an expansionary policy would lower the reserve requirement, which would make more money available to the banks. They could lend it as excess reserves, and through the multiplier process that would increase, and the economy would have more money moving through it. So this would be expansionary. The discount rate is the rate that the Federal Reserve charges to its member banks for short-term loans. And this is not used so much anymore, and you'll read in your textbook about how that's been largely replaced by the federal funds system where banks lend to each other, and there's a market rate and a target set by the Fed for that market. But the discount rate still exists as a tool, and if the Fed decides to, they can serve as the lender of last resort. So the discount rate then, if they want to expand the economy, well, let's do contractionary first. They could raise it for a contractionary policy. An increase in the discount rate would make it more expensive for member banks to borrow, would discourage that borrowing, leaving less money in the banks themselves to create loans, therefore contracting the money supply. So an increase in the discount rate would achieve that. A decrease in the discount rate would be expansionary, because that would put more money into the banks, allow them to have it at a lower price anyway, and encourage the lending behavior that moves through the economy. So you'd have expansionary and contractionary behavior related to the discount rate, although rarely used. The last one that exists here, and this is the one that is most frequently used, is the open market operations. Open market operations, by definition, is the buying and selling of government securities or treasuries. These are bonds, and it's important to know what they are because these bonds represent debt. So a bond is a debt instrument that says, you give me this nifty piece of paper that has all the terms of repayment on it, and I will give you my money. And essentially what we've achieved here is a loan. You'll pay me back over some period of time with interest. You have the use of my money in the meantime. So these government securities are bought and sold between the Federal Reserve and the banks. That's important to keep in mind. So when we're talking about the open market operations of the Fed, we're talking about them interacting with the banks to buy and sell these securities to the banks. So in order to expand, actually let me start with contractionary first because I want to be consistent here. So contractionary open market operations would be where they take money out of the banks, and they achieve that by selling bonds to the banks. They sell bonds to the banks. And the reason this works is because the banks then exchange money, actual money that would have gone into circulation into the loans, and instead they exchange that money for a bond certificate from the Federal Reserve that says, hey, we'll pay you back at some date in the future with some interest rate. So here's a little mnemonic device that might help you to remember this. When the Fed sells bonds to the banks, it makes the money supply smaller. Sell small. So a little mnemonic there, a little alliterative terminology might be helpful to you. Expansionary policy is when the Federal Reserve goes to the banks and they say, hey, you know what? We will buy the securities that you have, and in exchange for that, you give us the security notes, and we'll give you actual cash, and that cash comes from the Treasury. So they go to the banks to buy bonds to expand the money supply. So here's another mnemonic, kind of nifty. Buying bonds, when the Fed buys from the banks, it makes the economy bigger or the money supply bigger. And so you'll see in times of recession, that will be one of the policies that the Fed engages in to try to expand that money supply and get money out there. To understand how monetary policy affects the economy, you have to know that the goal is to affect the interest rates. And those interest rates specifically target 3 areas of aggregate demand. And the idea here is to get a change in behavior in consumption, investment, or net exports. So let's take a look at consumption. Consumption, if the interest rate, let's say we want to talk about expansionary policy. Expansionary policy would have a target of lowering the interest rate for buyers, for consumers, because if the interest rate falls, then people are going to be more interested in buying things, borrowing money to buy long-term purchases, things like that. So it will increase consumption. Let me show you graphically what I'm talking about here. And let's see if I can get a color I like. So here's the logic. Here's the graph of money supply, which is fixed because it's a fixed quantity determined by the Federal Reserve primarily. And here's money demand. And so you'll see this in your textbook, this graph. Now, the price measured on the vertical axis is our interest rate, our nominal interest rate. So the price of money, where it's exchanged, is the interest rate. And on the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of dollars. So price and quantity, similar to what you've seen before. So let's say that we're going to start in money supply 1. And the Fed looks at the output level, of course, the quantity that's being consumed, and they say, you know what, our goal here is to lower the interest rate. Well, they can take an action here that increases the money supply. So this is going to be expansionary policy. Expansionary, ARY, is to increase the money supply. Graphically, we could see that as a shift to the right. So here's our new money supply. When that money supply shifts out, notice that it moves along that money demand curve. And you can realize pretty easily that if money becomes cheaper for use by consumers, they're going to want more of it. So the quantity demanded increases. So here's the original quantity demanded. Here's the new quantity demanded. So more money is demanded. And as a result, that interest rate or the price of money falls. So this should look somewhat familiar to you. This would be expansionary policy because what they do is they take an action to increase the money supply using one of their tools and as a result, decrease the interest rate for consumption. And of course, a decreased interest rate for consumption means greater consumption. And remember, aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So if consumption is one of the components, and it is the largest component, by the way, of aggregate demand, is going to lead us to then an increase in aggregate demand. And ultimately, the goal is to increase aggregate demand, increase output, and we can go to our previous graph where we looked at aggregate supply and demand together to see that if aggregate demand shifts to the right, output increases as well. So that's one way. The second effort that they make is to change interest rates with respect to investment. And so let's go with this. And investment, let's again talk about expansionary money supply policy. So expansionary policy, again, the goal here is to increase the money supply in order to decrease that interest rate. So we're going to see the same thing here. We're going to have an increase in, here's demand, here's the money supply, here's the price of money effectively, and here's the quantity. Right there. And so if the Federal Reserve engages in any one of those policies, but most often, almost always, it's open market operations. So let's say that they then buy bonds from the banks, which puts more money into the bank's pocket. So they expand the money supply. As a result, what happens here? Well, the interest rate, the price of money falls. There's more of it. And the demand for that money in terms of investors, because investors, if they can get their hands on the money cheaper, it's going to incentivize and encourage investment. So investment demand goes up, and as a result, investment is one of those components of aggregate demand, and we would see an increase in aggregate demand. Finally, our last one is a look at net exports. And the way net exports are targeted here is, again, through the interest rate. But really what we're trying to do is change the American interest rate relative, or the domestic, I should say, interest rate relative to the interest rates of others. So here's what they do. They increase the money supply. So just like we saw before, this is expansionary. So they would increase the money supply to lower the interest rate. And if the interest rate is lower relative to other countries, and this is the key here, the effect here is one of a change of imports. So if the interest rate is lower relative to other countries, and the value of the US dollar falls, which we always think of as, that sounds bad, right? The value of the US dollar is low. No, the US dollar value being low actually increases exports and decreases imports, because relative to the American dollar, now other people in other countries can afford to buy our goods more easily. So our exports rise as they become cheaper in other countries. Our imports fall as the goods coming into our country are relatively more expensive for us. And that's going to lead to an increase in net exports. And this, of course, is part of aggregate demand. So if net exports rises, then aggregate demand rises. So all of these components of aggregate demand are targeted through these changes in the money supply. And this is achieved through the actions of the Federal Reserve. So as we go forward, I just want you to keep this in mind, that the Federal Reserve has a very specific set of tools available to them, and their policies are intended to achieve these goals of either expansion or contraction through changes in the interest rate. And keep in mind that anything that can be expanded by an increase in the money supply, the opposite will be true if they decide to engage in contractionary monetary policy. Decreasing the money supply would increase the interest rate, discourage consumption, discourage investment, discourage net exports. So all of that is going to be true. So next we're going to get into the homework for chapter 15. And let's take a look at this. So we start by looking at which of the following is not a monetary policy goal of the Federal Reserve Bank. And so right off the bat, we can say, well, one of the goals, we didn't really talk about those in the last little bit, but the goals themselves are that of having stable financial markets, low unemployment, and higher living standards. All of that would be certainly goals of the Federal Reserve as they're enacting monetary policy. Low prices are not one of their goals. They don't focus on that. Number two, when the Federal Open Market Committee decides to increase the money supply, what does it do to U.S. securities? And this is where we use that little mnemonic. Increase, buy big. Remember that? So they're going to buy U.S. Treasury securities. If they wish to decrease the money supply, what are they going to do? They're going to sell small. So keep those mnemonics in mind. They seem very silly, but they're very helpful to help you remember this. Just keep in mind that it is the Fed buying from the banks, the Fed selling to the banks. Next, as the figures to the right indicate, the Fed can affect both the money supply and interest rates. However, in recent years, the Fed targets interest rates in monetary policy more often than it does the money supply. Which interest rate does the Fed target? And so targeting here is going to be connected to what I mentioned briefly, but it's also found in your book, and this is the federal funds rate. More and more, they target this rate by which banks lend to each other in a market for short-term loans. So that's going to be important to know. They can affect both the money supply and the interest rates through that. But when it comes to targeting rates, what they target is in the federal funds market. The federal funds rate, just as a definition, is the rate that banks charge to each other for short-term loans or excess reserves. And so there's a market there, and you can see in the previous question, it kind of gives you an idea of how the market works. There's the supply of money in that market, there's demand, and the rate itself is that intersection between the two, and it is targeted by the Fed, but not necessarily achieved or controlled fully. In the figure to the right, when the money supply increased from MS1 to MS2, the equilibrium interest rate fell from 4 to 3%. Why? And this is an important thing because we already talked about how the Federal Reserve targets this in their policy, not targets it exactly as the rate, but their policy is intended to achieve this result. And how does that happen? Well, all of these things are true. It increases demand for Treasury securities and therefore drives up their prices. It increases demand for Treasury securities and also drives down their interest rate because price and interest rate are going to be inversely related. And initially, more firms hold more money than they want relative to other financial assets because it lowers the opportunity cost of holding that money. So all of the above are true. And this is just a little note here to kind of remind you of that, the impact of a change in the money supply on the interest rate and how those different steps occur. The blank is considered, the most relevant interest rate when conducting monetary policy. So it is the short-term nominal interest rate. Okay, so here it is. The short-term nominal interest rate is the most relevant. Unlike long-term rates, the goal for the Fed is initially to affect short-term nominal and hope that with time, long-term rates are impacted. But an immediate change occurs to the short run. In the figure on the right, the opportunity cost of holding money does what when you move from point A to point B? So hopefully you can see that it decreases. And you've got a little definition down here as well. The opportunity cost is what you give up in order to engage in a particular activity. So the interest rate is the cost of holding money. So when the interest rates are low, the opportunity cost of holding the money is low. You're not giving up very much. So it falls when it goes from A to B. Same is true. Next, in the figure to the right, which of the following events is most likely to cause the shift of the money demand curve from MD1 to MD2, specifically from A to C? In this case, we're going to see that it's going to be an increase in real GDP or an increase in the price level. And you can read down here, an increase in GDP means, real GDP, means that the amount of buying and selling will increase, which would cause an increase in money demand. And a higher price level would also cause an increase in money demand as more money is needed for those things. Next, can the Fed eliminate recession? The Fed uses monetary policy to offset the effects of a recession, high unemployment and falling prices, when actual real GDP falls short of potential GDP, and the effects of a rapid expansion. Can the Fed, therefore, eliminate recessions? And this is discussed in your textbook and at some length. And the fact is that they cannot eliminate it. However, they can soften the effects. So they can only soften the magnitude of recessions, not eliminate them. They can take their actions. Next, changes in interest rates affect aggregate demand. Which of the following is affected by changes in interest rates and as a result impacts aggregate demand? And this is something I went over at the very beginning of this, and it's going to be the things that we mentioned. So it's going to be consumption, investment, and the value of the dollar through the net exports effect. Government spending is not part of that. And this, by the way, goes through what your textbook has to say about those effects. And if you're still having a little struggle with that, I would encourage you to go through that again. Next, we've got consider the figures below and determine which is the best description of what causes the shift from aggregate demand 1 to 2. So our aggregate demand shift is to the left. It's a decrease. And it goes from 1 to 2. And in the B, that's in A, by the way. And in B, it goes to the right for an increase. So we can look at this and we can say, well, example A shows a contractionary monetary policy, which would be true. That would shift that aggregate demand curve to the left by lowering the money supply and raising interest rates. It would also lower the price level and real GDP. We can see that right here on this. Y2 is real GDP is lower and P2. So A is true. However, let's look at the other ones. Example B shows an expansionary monetary policy and the price level and GDP both rise. That's also true. We see that shift to the right in aggregate demand. We see that increase in Y and the increase in the price level. So that's true. C says, example A shows an expansionary monetary policy. No. And D, both examples show expansionary. Not true. So our correct answer here is A and B. Next, the open market purchase. Suppose the economy is in equilibrium in the first period at point A. In the second period, the economy reaches point B. What policy would the Fed likely pursue in order to move AD2 to AD2 policy, subword there, and reach equilibrium point C? So in the second period, what policy will increase the price level and increase actual GDP? So in this case, this is going to be open market purchases. So all the other ones, first of all, decrease taxes, that's fiscal policy. Increase the discount rate would decrease aggregate demand. And to increase the reserve requirement would also decrease. Those are both contractionary policies. So the only one that works here is B. Moving on, if the Federal Reserve is late to recognize a recession and implements an expansionary policy too late, the result could be an increase in inflation during the beginning of the next phase. Even though the goal had been to reduce the severity of the recession, the poor timing caused another problem, inflation. This is an example of what type of policy, and by definition, pro-cyclical. Next, the figure to the right illustrates the economy using the dynamic aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Probably be used to seeing this by now. If actual real GDP in 2006 occurs at point B, so here's point B, and potential GDP occurs at LROAS 6, so here's potential, here's actual. What kind of policy is the federal bank going to pursue? And in this case, they're going to pursue contractionary policy, because what you've got here, you've got actual in excess of potential, which is going to be called an inflationary gap right here. And that puts inflationary pressures on the economy. Therefore, the Federal Reserve is going to take action to contract the money supply and to eliminate that gap. So the figure to the right, then we're going back to the same question. Now that we said, okay, that's going to be contractionary policy. If the Fed's policy is successful, what's going to be the effect on the policy on the following macroeconomic indicators? So what's going to happen to actual GDP? It's going to decrease. Potential real GDP stays the same, no change. The price level will fall, and the unemployment level will fall as well, assuming that inflationary pressure is managed. Next, another scenario using the same model. Suppose the economy is in equilibrium in the first period at point A. Here's our equilibrium. In the second period, the economy reaches point B. We would expect the Fed to pursue what type of policy in order to move AD2 to AD2 with the policy? So how do we get from B to C, essentially? And this would be expansionary monetary policy. You can see that it's shifting that aggregate supply curve to the right, and that's achieved. And also it increases aggregate demand, which is achieved through expansionary monetary policy. So what would happen to each of these indicators as a result? We would see an increase in real GDP, and we can see it here on the graph. We would have no change in potential. The price level would increase, and unemployment would decrease as a result. So again, we have the figure of the dynamic model. Suppose the economy is in equilibrium in the first period at point A. In the second period, the economy reaches point B. And what policy would the Fed likely pursue in order to move from here, B, to C, AD2 with policy? In the second period, what would they do? And we know that it's going to be expansionary. We just saw that. What kind of expansionary policy would we find below in this list? And all these others would be contractionary except for right here, the open market purchase. So buy big. Remember that little mnemonic. Consider the following table. What can we expect from the Federal Reserve? Actually, we'll go to the second one here. If it seeks to move the economy in the direction of long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So if they're going to move from where potential GDP and real GDP are equal to one another, closer to it, how are they going to achieve this? And they're going to do contractionary policy, right? Because when real GDP is out of equilibrium, they want to move toward equilibrium. So how do they get there? Well, they would have to reduce the amount of money in the economy. So they're going to contract. If their policy is successful, what's that going to mean? Well, actual GDP will fall. Potential real GDP does not change. That means not change. The price level will fall, and unemployment will rise. And we can see all that. We can see the price level changing here. We can see the actual and potential numbers changing. Not the potential number, just the actual. What is inflation targeting? And this is a policy that commits the central bank to achieve an announced level of inflation. So they pick a target based on all the information they have. They come out, they announce this target, and then they remain committed to it since they've made such a very public announcement. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman and his followers belong to a school of thought known as monetarism. What do the monetarists argue that the Fed should target. And they say that the Fed should target the money supply, not the interest rate, and that it should adopt the money growth rule. So as the name implies, monetarists say, let's put all the focus on the money supply. The interest rates will follow. Consider the figure to the right. This is the next one. Can the Fed achieve a $900 billion money supply and a 5% interest rate at point C? Can they achieve that? So we can say 900 billion, here's the money supply, and here's the 5% rate. And it should be pretty clear graphically that they cannot, because they can't target both the money supply and the interest rate simultaneously. They can only do one or the other. So let's take a look at the Taylor rule. According to the Taylor rule, what is the federal funds target rate under the following conditions? And we're given some economic variables. Down here, you can see that we have a formula for calculating that using the variables and some definitions of what each of these measures is. So if we take it from our definition here, we can start with the inflation rate. So the federal funds equals the current inflation rate, which is 2%, plus real equilibrium federal funds rate, which is given to us as 3%, plus 1/2 of the inflation gap. Now the inflation gap is the difference between real inflation, current inflation I should say, and targeted inflation. So in this case, it's going to be 1/2 of current inflation, which is 2%, minus target inflation, which is given here as 3%. So that's going to be a negative 0.5, 1/2 of that. And then the last one is the output gap. It's 1/2 of the output gap. So we're going to take 1/2 times, and the output gap is the difference between real GDP and potential GDP. So real GDP is less than, it's the difference between, it's a -2. So we're going to take 1/2 of -2, that's going to be -1. So when we put this together, we've got 2 plus 3 minus 1.5. So 5 minus 1.5 is going to be 3.5%. And in your homework, you're going to see this in different versions. Just make sure you know this part down here, how to come to that. It's a little bit tricky, but it can be done. Just remember that negative values and things like that have to be carried forward. What two institutions did Congress create in order to increase the availability of mortgages in a secondary market? This is something we saw in a big way recently. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are both these institutions. How do investment banks differ from commercial banks? And there's a few ways. In this list, investment banks generally don't lend to households. That is one thing. And investment banks do not take deposits. So those are the two correct answers there. And then finally, why did the Fed help JP Morgan Chase buy Bear Stearns? And it's because of A, the failure of Bear Stearns would lead to a larger investment bank failure. They were really afraid of too big to fail. And also C, commercial banks would be reluctant to lend to investment banks. Therefore, A and C is the correct answer here. All right, so that is our homework for this chapter, chapter 15. Please ask specific questions if you have them, and I wish you lots of luck.